Okay, let me talk a little bit about the history of the period. Since these are legends and not actually as close to the events that they purport to show us, we're not exactly sure about what I would call the historicity of these figures. However, they do represent the way the Israelites found themselves relatively early in their history. And you'll see that the dating, as we move on in these tapes and as we move on in class, the dating becomes increasingly more precise as we get further and further away from this earlier material in Genesis. We'll be a little bit more precise when we get to Moses, and we will be able to be very precise down to the year by the time we get to King David. In fact, that's one of the dates you're all going to have to memorize, is the date when King David became king. And it's a very easy date to remember. It's 1000 BCE. Which reminds me, I have to introduce a little bit about the dating system. Usually, in most cultures, and this is the dominant one in our planet right now, dating started, in other words, we started numbering the years roughly at the time of the birth of Christ. I say roughly because by most estimates now, Christ is regarded to have been born something like 3 years before the time that this dating starts, so 3 BCE. Everything before this date traditionally is called BC, which probably means something in some other language, but I have not been able to locate it. I've always heard it, and probably you have, as before Christ. And everything after this time is known as AD, which I do know what that means, Anno Dominus, the year of our Lord. So it's how many years after the time of Christ's birth. Unfortunately, there are many people who are now compelled by necessity to use this dating system who in fact are not Christians, who do not regard Christ as the Lord or as God. And so there's tried to be a way to kind of soften the cultural exclusivity of this dating system. And I use it because I deal with a lot of audiences where everybody's not a Christian, where some people are Muslims, where some people are Jews or Hindus or whatever. And so this is what we've come up with. Every time before this is BCE, which stands for before the Common Era. Everything after this is called CE, which stands for Common Era. And that's what I'm going to be using. Now, of course, this isn't the way anyone dated the world until actually a few hundred years after the time of Christ, when this became the dating system. Mostly, people dated things by king, so the 16th year into the reign of King Hezekiah, or they dated by some kind of a disaster, 20 years after the great earthquake. And this kind of universal dating system really didn't come into play until the time of the Roman Empire, when things were dated from the founding of the Roman Empire. And then subsequently, when the Roman Empire became Christian, it was dated from the time of Christ. So this is the way we're going to date things. And of course, when you're doing before the birth of Christ, and everything we're doing this semester is before the birth of Christ, of course. So when you're doing things before the birth of Christ, the dates go backwards. So 1000 BCE is 500 years before 500 BCE. You're born in 1000 BCE, and you live for 500 years, and you die, it'll be 500 BCE. Everything goes backwards. Further, just to confuse and complicate things even more, we number centuries. And just as when we go into the CE time, the century is always one more than the year. So we are in still the 1900s. Who knows? Maybe there'll be people watching this tape after the year 2000. But say right now we're in the 1900s, and so we're in the 20th century. Well, likewise, as you go backwards, the year is always one less in hundreds than the century numbered. So the 5th century is the 400s, and the 4th century is the 300s, and I do, in fact, use both. So my apologies. I'll try to help you navigate through all this. Anyway, I said all that to say this one thing, that most people date the period of the ancestors somewhere between, and look how broad and general this is, somewhere between 2000 and 1500 BCE. So keep in mind, we're going to use the date of David's ascension to the throne as a hook for us all semester long, and that was 1000 BCE. Well, so this is anywhere from 1,000 to 500 years before the time of David. A very, very different period of time. And I'm going to draw our map of the ancient Near East again. And remember, this is, well, actually, during the time of Abraham, this area of the ancient Near East is called Canaan. Same place as Palestine, same place as Israel. We're going to call it Canaan now. And over here, we have the two rivers, the Tigris in the north, the Euphrates in the south. This is Mesopotamia. And there is a city in Mesopotamia, I believe it's up here, but you better check your map to make sure. I'm certainly not going to test you on this, called Ur. U-R. And Abraham is understood to have come from the land of Ur. And we do in fact know that in this period of human history, we have a lot of migrations. We have a lot of people that are moving backwards and forwards through this region. I forgot something about geography on the other tape. I called this area Mesopotamia, but the whole area of settlement in the ancient Near East is in a roughly crescent shape that goes through Mesopotamia, down through Palestine, and then finally through Egypt in North Africa. And that's in roughly a crescent shape in this whole region. Another term I want you to be familiar with is called the Fertile Crescent. Anyway, Abraham and his family come from Ur and they move over here. This all happens in Genesis chapter 11 to another city in the region called Haran, H-A-R-A-N. And it's from there that the action starts. And so when Abraham moves into Canaan, he does not move in as a settler. He's not moving in there to live. He is kind of a traveler. He's depicted as what would be called in anthropological terms a semi-nomad. That is somebody who through half the year travels around with his flocks and the other half of the year lives in some kind of a settled village or community. So he's a semi-nomad moving into this land, and there are people who live in the land. The people who live in the land are called, in a general sense, Canaanites, and we'll be coming across that term quite frequently. And then a lot of little areas, little cities with kings. Each of them have their own names. So a lot of peoples with different names, all of which, in the way it appears in English from the Hebrew, ends in ites. So we have Canaanites and Perizzites and Hittites and Hivites and all of these guys living in this region. So Abraham moves into this region where it's not his home. He's moving in as kind of a traveler who's moving through. And then when there's a famine, he moves down to Egypt, which is where he has that incident with his wife that I talked about, and then he moves back into the land. He's not somebody who belongs. For his entire life, he doesn't own one tiny particle of this land that he's traveling in, except when his wife Sarah dies, then he buys a burial plot for her. And that's the first land that Abraham has in this region of the world, and he dies with just his wife's burial plot in his possession. But anyway, I just want you to situate it, and I want you to understand that when Abraham moves into Canaan, he moves in, he's not a Canaanite. He does not speak the Canaanite language. He is not familiar with the Canaanite culture. He moves into a land that is not his, as a stranger and as a settler. However, according to the text, and we'll be looking at this in a few moments, according to the text, this God, who ultimately will be identified as the God of the Israelites, promises to Abraham all this land. In fact, I will read this right now. This is Genesis chapter 12. It's on page 16 if you have the same Bible as me, the New Oxford Annotated Bible with Apocrypha New Revised Standard Version. On page 16, this is Genesis, the 12th chapter, and God promises to Abraham, chapter 12, verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So Abraham, through his life, and then through the lives of his children and his grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on, as we shall see, his deity, his personal deity, the God who appeared to him and told him to leave his land and come into this other land, promises him that he is going to be given this land that belongs to others, this land that's inhabited by others, this land in which Abraham is moving through as a stranger and a visitor. So you could already see at this early time the issues beginning to raise, which now are flaring up in the contemporary Arab-Israeli conflict. It's wrong to identify Arabs with Canaanites. That's not exactly the case. But in fact, we have now a new group that identify as Israelis in the modern sense, moving into the land and claiming that it belongs to them. And then there are other people who are living there who say, no, it belongs to us. So that's where a lot of the early problems that we're going to see take place in the story of the ancestors and beyond. And that's probably enough history for us now